We talk a lot about living in space someday, but before that happens, we'd answer a simpler question. How close are we to spending a week there and calling it a vacation? Why space hotels matter now? We tend to imagine space hotels as something far off in the future, lumped in mentally with orbital cities, routine habitats, and the kind of science fiction settings where space is already crowded, civilized, and routine. But the idea of people staying in orbit for a few days or a week, sleeping there, eating there, relaxing there, is no longer some distant sci-fi milestone. It's something we've already begun testing, in small, expensive, and very tentative ways. The real question isn't whether space hotels are possible. We already know that they are. The question is how close we are to them becoming normal enough to matter, normal enough that they stop being heroic one-off missions and start becoming destinations. Somewhere people go, stay, and come back from, without it being a global news event every time. That shift from experiment to industry is what actually defines the arrival of space hotels. To get there, we need to talk about scale, price, and purpose, because the difference between a novelty and a real destination isn't just technology, it's how many people go, how often they go, and why they're willing to pay to be there. What do we mean by a space hotel? First, it helps to clear up what we mean by a space hotel in the first place, and it probably won't match earthly versions. For instance, the gift shop is probably back on the ground. We don't really know what they will look like, and ideas vary a lot, so the terms get used loosely, and not every structure in orbit where people sleep qualifies the way most of us intuitively imagine. A hotel is, at its core, temporary habitation. It's a place you stay, not somewhere you permanently live. That includes vacations, but also includes business travel, short-term assignments, inspections, and oversight. Resorts are a narrower category. A resort exists primarily for leisure. It survives because people want to be there, not because they have to be. This difference will matter in a lot of design options. For instance, we can include gravity by spinning a station, but might not for cost or for the experience. And someone on a leisure trip might want to enjoy microgravity, while someone on a business trip needs to get used to working it before traveling or to fix a satellite. They both might want it and enjoy it too, but both might also want gravity when it's time to sleep or use the plumbing. Otherwise, sleep tends to involve donning something close to a straitjacket and getting Velcro to the wall while gobbling sleeping pills, as microgravity is not particularly conducive to sleep, as we often assume it would be in science fiction, though low gravity might be. Early space hotels are likely to be a mix of astronauts and scientists conducting missions and wealthy space tourists. The true resort phase comes later, when tourism alone could plausibly keep the lights on and folks are looking for more to do than simply float around. Where human spaceflight is today. Right now, human spaceflight is still firmly in the experimental phase. Over the entire history of spaceflight, fewer than 1,000 people have ever been to space at all. Each mission is planned months or years in advance. Every seat is precious. Every failure is treated as unacceptable, not merely unfortunate. That mindset makes sense when you're operating at the margins of possibility, but it does not scale well. The International Space Station and the private missions that have visited it are remarkable achievements, but they are not the prototypes of a tourism industry. They are closer to Antarctic research stations or early polar expeditions than to hotels. Even when private individuals visit, they do so under conditions that resemble astronaut training more than travel. Long preparation, intensive safety protocols, and enormous per-person costs are baked into the system. That's not a criticism, it's simply recognition of where we are on the curve. To understand how we get from here to something we comfortably call a space hotel, we need to think in terms of throughput. How many people go per year matters far more than whether someone can go at all. A handful of visitors annually is not a hotel, no matter how luxurious the interior might be. It's an outpost that occasionally hosts guests. A useful threshold to keep in mind is surprisingly modest. If you had 100 people going to orbit every week, that's roughly 5,000 people per year. That number alone is already transformative. 5,000 people annually going to space would represent an order of magnitude more humans than have ever been there across all of history. At that point, spaceflight stops being a rare life event and starts being an operational challenge. Supporting that level of traffic means you need regular launch schedules, predictable logistics, permanent staff who rotate in and out, and systems designed for turnover rather than endurance alone. You also have to abandon any design that requires extreme training on the customer's end in advance. A day of prep before launch might be optimistic. so you need an environment that is hard to accidentally wreck. Whereas right now, space travel requires careful training and cautious minds not to accidentally kill everyone. At 5,000 people per year, you can plausibly sustain a genuine orbital hotel. Not necessarily a luxury resort, but a place with staff, schedules, redundancy, and routine. A place where people arrive every week, leave every week, and are replaced by the next group. That's the point where the concept stops being symbolic and starts being real. And it's worth pausing on just how big that leap is. 5,000 people per year does not sound enormous by Earth standards, but in spaceflight terms it's staggering. It requires us to move from treating every human mission as exceptional to treating them as expected. The hardware can survive that transition. The physics allows it. The bigger challenge is cultural and economic. Real-world attempts at space hotels. This is not just theoretical. Several companies have already tried, some successfully, some prematurely, to stake out the idea of orbital hotels, and their failures are as instructive as their progress. Bigelow Aerospace represents the clearest early proof that space hotels are not a speculative fantasy, but an engineering problem that's already been partially solved. Bigelow's focus on inflatable habitat technology was deliberately pragmatic. Inflatable modules offer far more internal value per kilogram than rigid structures, which is exactly what you want if you're thinking about human comfort rather than just survival. The Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 test modules demonstrated these habitats could survive launch, deploy correctly, maintain pressure, resist micrometeorite impacts, and operate autonomously in orbit for years at a time. Genesis 1 was up there for almost 20 years. And outlived the company. In many ways, Bigelow's work answered one of the most important questions about space hotels early on. Can we build living spaces in orbit that feel spacious without being prohibitively massive? The answer was clearly yes. What limited the program was not the concept or hardware, but the broader ecosystem. Launch costs, flight cadence, and the size of potential customer base, at the time, simply were not yet aligned with the scale needed to sustain a commercial hospitality operation. That does not diminish the achievement. If anything, it places Bigelow Aerospace in the role of a pathfinder, demonstrating a solution for the market was ready to absorb it. Inflatable habitats remain one of the most attractive design options for future orbital hotels, precisely because of that early work. That lineage did not end there. Sierra Space has continued to develop large inflatable habitat concepts, most notably through its life habitat design. These build directly on the same core insight, that human scale value, not just survivability, is essential if people are going to stay in orbit comfortably for days or weeks at a time. What distinguishes Sierra Space's approach is timing. Their concepts are being developed alongside modern reusable launch vehicles, and with an eye toward mixed-use stations that can host research, industry, and eventually tourism. From a space hotel perspective, this reinforces the idea that large, comfortable orbital living spaces are no longer speculative hardware. They're just waiting on sufficient launch cadence and customer flow. A different, more incremental path is being pursued by Axiom Space, which has taken the lesson that timing and integration matter as much as architecture. Rather than immediately attempting to stand up a fully independent space hotel, Axiom plans to build directly on existing infrastructure. In one plan, by attaching commercial modules to the International Space Station, Axiom could host private astronauts, researchers, and government-sponsored missions within a well-understood operational framework. This approach allows demand to grow organically, while training pipelines, logistics change, and safety practices mature alongside it. What makes this strategy particularly relevant to space hotels is that it mirrors how many terrestrial industries develop. Early hotels often appear alongside existing hubs, ports, rails, terminals, or trade centers, before branching out into destinations of their own. Axiom's long-term plan to detach its modules and operate them as independent station reflects that same logic. It's less about a sudden leap to tourism and more about letting tourism emerge naturally once a steady flow of professional and institutional visitors already exists. Underlying all these efforts are companies focused less on hotels themselves and more on enabling infrastructure that makes them viable. SpaceX and Blue Origin, while not hotel operators, play a central role by driving down launch costs and increasing flight cadence. Hotels do not need revolutionary destinations, they need transportation systems that fly often, predictably, and without ceremony, what commercial aviation was to the global hotel industry. A more speculative but conceptually important example comes from Above Space Development, formerly Orbital Assembly Corporation, which had focused on rotating space stations designed to provide artificial gravity. I worked with them briefly in their early days, and while their initial gateway proposal was undeniably ambitious, it was also one of the first serious attempts to examine a von Braunbiel scale station through the lens of an actual business plan rather than pure futurism. Their proposals highlight a key assumption shift that becomes increasingly relevant as space hotels move beyond novelty. Early visitors must actively want the experience of weightlessness, but longer stays change the equation. Comfort, sleep quality, ease of movement, and long-term health all become selling points once customers have options. The significance of rotating designs is not whether a specific timeline proves accurate, but what they imply about a future market. They assume that orbital destinations will eventually compete on experience, not just access. Artificial gravity becomes less a scientific luxury and more of a hospitality feature, akin to private bathrooms or climate control, something guests don't think about much until it's missing. Gravity is a weird partner in life. It can really weigh you down, but on the other hand, there's all sorts of little things about you miss when it's gone. Taken together, these efforts illustrate an important point. There is no single blueprint for a space hotel. Some approaches prioritize volume efficiency, others leverage existing infrastructure, others focus on long-term comfort, and still others concentrate on lowering the cost of access itself. Space hotels will not emerge from one company getting everything right, but from an ecosystem maturing to the point where staying in orbit becomes routine enough to support choice. That's the inflection point we're circling. Price points and who shows up. Price is the next critical variable. Who can afford to go and why determines how large that throughput can become, and how quickly. Today, the effective price of sending a human to orbit and back is extraordinarily high, even with modern and reusable rockets. When you add together launch costs, life support, training, insurance, and the fact that every passenger is still treated like a partial astronaut, you are talking about tens of millions of dollars per person. That confines spaceflight to governments, institutions, and the ultra-wealthy, though keep in mind we have thousands of billionaires and tens of thousands of folks who could afford that ticket while still having the supermajority of their wealth left over. But there is a very important distinction between what something costs today and what it could cost once it's done routinely. Early air travel was ruinously expensive, slow, and dangerous. That didn't stop it from becoming normal once enough infrastructure, experience, and demand accumulated. The fuel to put a person and their luggage into orbit only costs a few $1,000s even today. What makes space expensive is everything else, and those are precisely the costs that fall as technology matures and flight rates increase. That's why, while $10 million per person may be today's ceiling, $10,000 is not an unreasonably long-term floor once reusability and scale really kick in. A useful thought experiment is ask what happens at different price points, not by predicting dates, but asking who shows up when the cost drops. At around $1 million per person for a week in orbit, you already unlock a surprisingly large market. Not millions of people, but tens of thousands globally. Ultra-high net worth individuals, corporate-sponsored trips, governments, institutions, and prestige-driven experiences all fit comfortably at that level. A week-long experiment on various crystals growing microgravity suddenly can afford to have an actual expert on those accompanying them to handle the work. The military would decide it's time to start sending a squad of Special Forces troops to microgravity to train on station raids and breaches. And a disproportionate number of the very wealthy are also geeky tech types who grew up on sci-fi, and while they might not pay $1 million for a short suborbital flight, although many do even now, there might be a lot more wanting to spend a week up there. Some producer is going to want to take a small film team and some actors up there to film real microgravity scenes for a space movie. If someone offered a 1-week orbital stay for $1 million today, the limiting factor would not be finding customers. It would be moving them safely, frequently, and reliably enough. That's an important insight. Demand appears before infrastructure does. The physics does not forbid $1 million orbital vacation. The problem is that our current systems are optimized for rarity, not volume. They can support a handful of people at extreme cost, not tens of thousands at merely very high cost. As prices fall further, the character of the market changes. At a few $100,000, it's still elite travel, but it's no longer dynastic wealth. It starts to resemble the early days of luxury cruising or private aviation. The most dramatic shift happens when prices approach the $10,000 range. At that point, space travel becomes aspirational rather than exclusive. Millions of households worldwide could plausibly afford such a trip once, especially with years of saving or financing. It becomes the luxury cruise or month-long trip to Europe. You do not need everyone to go. You only need enough people to want to go that scale becomes self-sustaining. That's the point where space hotels stop being supported by novelty or prestige and start being supported by raw volume. And volume changes everything. Business travel, the quiet enabler. But tourism alone is not the whole story, especially early on. Business travel plays a critical and often overlooked role in making space hotels viable long before they become resorts. We already send people across the planet on short notice to inspect facilities, oversee projects, troubleshoot problems, and make decisions that can't be delegated to remote systems. We do it because human judgment, improvisation, and accountability still matter. Space will be no different. As orbital infrastructure grows, satellite servicing, manufacturing, construction, research, there will be moments when sending a person makes more sense than relying on automation alone. Not because robots are useless, but because edge cases are expensive, delays are costly, and sometimes you want a human there to see what's actually happening. If your billion-dollar telescope needs a patch, and you think there's a 1% chance that having a human on site will make that outcome better than telepresence robots, you spend $1 million to send a person there. That business traffic helps fill rooms, justify staff, and normalize operations long before leisure travel alone could do so. In many ways, it's the bridge between experimental stations and true resorts. I was considering all the weird places we might build space hotels in the future, beyond Earth and the solar system, and it occurred to me that all those local astronomical anomalies would be logical tourist destinations. There's an amazing guide video out now on nebula from the Overview Effect, the nearest astronomical anomalies, that walks through all the nearest pulsars, black holes, and other local space anomalies. Once we start thinking of space hotels as otherworldly destinations, we have to contemplate how the guests and staff can keep in touch with home. That's a lot harder as we move beyond low Earth orbit, but fundamentally, a civilization spread across space still needs to stay connected. That's what I explore in this month's Nebula exclusive, The Future of Interstellar Communication. It examines how we design signals that can cross light years without falling apart, how relay networks might replace giant beacons, and why communicating between stars is as much about thinking in centuries as about engineering antennas. Nebula is home to tons of awesome content from myself, The Overview Effect, and many other creators. Use my link with the QR code on the screen and get 50% off an annual plan. Just $30 for the whole year, about $2.50 a month. Head to go.nebula.tv/IsaacArthur and start watching today. Thresholds, not milestones. At this point in the episode, the pattern should be clear. Space hotels do not arrive all at once. They emerge as thresholds are crossed. A few people per year is exploration. A few hundred is novelty. A few thousand is an industry. Tens of thousands is normalization. The question, how close are we, is not about a single launch or a single structure. It's about how quickly we can move up those thresholds, and what changes when we do. We also need to be mindful that there's probably only a short period when there's only one hotel. Competition is likely to see half a dozen hotels able to hold 50 to 200 people rather than one able to hold 1,000, and each will want to distinguish how it's better. You get the first one with a rotating section for low gravity, the first with a cafe or a bar or a zero-G racquetball court. Probably also one that quietly brags of less reputable goods and services being available too. Fill in the mental blank there, but if it's available at modern resorts and isn't a specialty of that type of resort, like surfing or skiing are, then expect to see it in space along with any space-unique things we can dream up, especially ones that don't require a lot of dedicated facilities and equipment. Space hotels will not arrive as a single grand opening with ribbon cuttings and headlines declaring the future has arrived, although I'm sure someone will do the first ribbon cutting in space. Instead, they are creeping into existence the way hotels always do, when enough people start passing through a place that staying becomes easier than leaving. At first there will be one, then a few, each trying to distinguish itself. A rotating section here, a better view there, a cafe, a gym, maybe amenities we recognize instantly from earthly resorts, just adapted to a very unusual environment. We've got a shower. And once that happens, once orbital hotels compete for guests rather than attention, space stops being a destination for the exceptional and becomes a place people argue about where to stay. That's not the end of space settlement, it's the moment it truly begins.